Good morning, everyone. Today we take a look at Psalm 78. This was written by Asaph, and this psalm is also considered a wisdom psalm, one that retells the history of Israel of their repeated sins of the past. It's also called a wisdom psalm because it exhorts the people, the reader, to remember the past, learn from the past, good or bad, to learn wisdom and to pass it on faithfully. Now, verse 1 says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." Asaph begins by asking for the attention of God's people so that they can hear the wisdom and the truth that he will share with them. Jeremiah 6:10 says, "To whom shall I speak and give warning, that they may hear? Indeed, their ear is uncircumcised, and they cannot give heed. Behold, the word of the Lord is a reproach to them. They have no delight in it." This is the audience that Asaph is addressing. They're getting to be where they're stubborn, hard-hearted, and he's wanting to give them a warning. Now verses 2 and 3 say, "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us." Dark sayings are referred to as riddles or hard questions. They are not like mystical incantations or anything like that. They're riddles or things that are hard questions. These were used by the Queen of Sheba when she asked Solomon hard questions in 2 Chronicles 9:1. They were used by Samson to trap his enemies in Judges 14:14. And Solomon was famous for various proverbs and riddles from 1 Kings 4:31. Simply, they are things that can be difficult to understand, sometimes referred to as riddles of truth, or as verse 3 tells us, truths that our fathers have known. Proverbs 6 verses 5 and 6 says, "A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles." A parable now is a comparison of two things for the intention of teaching. The word parable occurs more often in the New Testament, but it occurs 15 times in the Old Testament. Jesus constantly used these illustrations when speaking to the crowds. In fact, because the prophet said that he would use so many, he never spoke to them without at least one illustration. And Matthew 13:35 says, "For it had been prophesied, I will talk in parables. I will explain mysteries hidden since the beginning of time." The dark sayings of old, and other phrases that are used here are dark lessons or dark riddles. It doesn't mean, again, mystical incantations or anything evil. It just means something that's hard to understand. And here, Asaph is trying to show the relevance of past events against present conditions of the people. The term fathers is used 3 times, 2 of which refer to traditions passed on from the fathers for the benefit of those who come later. The third reference in verse 8 is a warning not to be like the fathers and not to make the same mistakes they made. In the Old Testament, the term fathers is often used for ancestors in general, or even for previous generations, without respects to family ties. In other words, we're not talking about directly, my father gave me this lesson, but my father as in ancestors, previous people who had lived before me. Another important term in the introduction is children, found 4 times in these verses. The traditions are to be taught to the children in order that they may learn from the past and maybe become and be more faithful. Verse 4 says, "We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done." It was God's will that each generation of Jewish people pass on God's word to the next generation. Joel 1:3 says, "Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation." And in Job 15:18, "What the wise have declared, hiding nothing from their ancestors." And that's what verse 4 says. We will not hide them from their children, showing the generation to come the praises of the Lord, his strength, and the works he's done. Verse 4 states that we will not hide them, the history, the truth, the good, the bad from our children. Here Asaph wants to declare the strength of God God's work for his people and how the people should be praising God and how they actually reacted to God's mercy and his generosity. God declared in Deuteronomy that the fathers should tell the children of their history. Deuteronomy 6:20 through verse 24. In the future, when your sons ask you what is the meaning of these stipulations, decrees, and laws of the Lord our God has commanded you, tell him, we were slaves of the Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes the Lord sent signs and wonders great and terrible on Egypt and the Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. Then Proverbs 4 explains the benefits of godly wisdom in the way it provides defense against the consequences associated with sin. Proverbs 4 verses 1 through 4. Listen, my sons, to a father's instructions. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart, keep my commands, and you will live. And this is what God wants us to do. He wants us to take hold of his words with our heart, keep his commands, and we will live eternally. This type of encouragement is found in Psalm 71:18, 79:13, 102:18, in Exodus, and many, many other places within the Bible, to listen and learn from those who came before us. This applies to us today, that we as Christians should share with our children and our grandchildren the history of the Bible, of God, our personal history, the history of our country. So, over the next few minutes, you might wonder where Roy is going with this. Please bear with me in this short history lesson for the United States. In 1778, James Madison, who is the architect of the federal Constitution, the fourth president, said this: we have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. That's the architect of the Constitution who said that. Now you can't even post the Ten Commandments in classrooms in school anymore. 69 years ago in 1952, the Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas said, we are a religious people. This is a Supreme Court Justice speaking. We are a religious people, and our institutions presuppose a supreme being. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So therefore, based on his work in June of 1954, Congress adopted the phrase, under God, to be added to the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. 67 years ago, in July of 1956, by joint resolution, Congress adopted the bill providing that the national motto of the United States is, in God we trust. In 1966, though, prayer was taken out of schools. Not only do we need to show our children what God has done, but how he is part of our heritage. If we do not teach our children and participate in the teaching of our grandchildren, then who is doing the teaching? How do they learn? The world is going to teach them. Their teachers are going to teach them. Their companions are going to teach them. The media is going to teach them. Cable TV and regular TV is going to teach them. And you're going to say, I'm just going to sit around and let them make up their own minds. This is a clip from a lecture given by a professor of educational psychiatry at Harvard University. He said every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiance towards our founding fathers, towards our elected officials, towards our parents, towards a belief in a supreme being, toward the sovereignty of his nation as a separate entity. So it is up to you, teachers, to make all these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. Does God hold you or me responsible to be a teacher of history, of life, of our faith to sons and daughters, our grandchildren? In verses 5 through 8, he says, For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. Asaph is telling his audience to tell the children about what God has done for their ancestors and how they forgot and failed. If you do not tell the children, then they will never know. It's easy to point to the Bible and show the failures of the Israelites and the mercy and grace and judgment of God. But when talking to our children, we need to point out our failures and the mercy and grace of judgment of God in our lives. As we will see, it is easy to take for granted the blessings of God, and when we do not get what we want or desire, and when we do not get what we desire or want, how easy it is to forget the blessings of God. Verse 9 says, the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. Now, Ephraim, future generations need to understand their own history. Asaph did not want the people to imitate, follow, or repeat the mistakes of the Exodus generation, the third generation of Hebrews that turned to the idols and paganism, or the generation of separation that created two kingdoms, specifically the northern kingdom or the kingdom of 10 tribes of Israel that abandoned God and established a false religion. Verse 9 points out a specific tribe of the northern kingdom, Ephraim, named after the second son of Joseph, who received a special blessing from Jacob. Genesis 48:20, so he blessed them by that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. If you remember, Ephraim was given the superior blessing, and the younger brother was put before the elder. Ephraim was not the firstborn, but God chose him to take the position of the firstborn. The tribe of Ephraim, who are the descendants of Ephraim, received land that included fertile valleys, strategic roads in the promised land. The tribe of Ephraim was the largest of the northern kingdom. It was the strongest and mightiest of the tribes. But over history, they created problems for Joshua when he was dividing the inheritance of the land up among the tribes. Joshua 17:14-18. And the children of Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, spoke unto Joshua, saying, why hast thou given me but one lot and one portion to inherit, seeing I am a great people, for as much as the Lord hath blessed me today? They threw up that, hey, God blessed us, we should get more, and we're the biggest. We are a great people. They also were trouble for Gideon in Judges 8:1. But the tribal leaders of Ephraim were violently angry with Gideon. Why didn't you send for us when you first went out to fight the Midianites? They demanded. They figured since they were the biggest, the mightiest, the strongest, that they should always be involved in the fight, always taking the lead. Being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. Because it's difficult on verse 9 to match this with any known instance in Israel's history, the various commentaries believe that Asaph is referring to a spiritual battle for that entire tribe. Spiritually speaking, God equipped Israel for conflict. They were blessed. They were armed and had bows, yet they often failed in the day of battle because they did not keep the covenant of God. They forgot his blessings. Verses 10-11 says, they kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. There's a shift coming in the next verse. He's speaking of specifically of the tribe of Ephraim, but now Asaph is going to speak about the entire nation of Israel, where he says in verse 12-18, marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoran. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters to stand as a heap, and in the daytime Also, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with the light of fire. He clave the rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink as one of the great out of the great depths. From the plagues in Egypt that led to their being given their freedom, to dividing the sea to allow them to escape, he led them in daylight, he led them at night, he fed them. How he brought forth water from a rock. The people saw miracle after miracle after miracle, but were never satisfied. They never appreciated what God was doing for them, what God provided for them. The people became more rebellious, became more and more demanding of God, and tested him. Verse 18 says they tempted God in their hearts. In other words, they put God to the test. Verse 41 of Psalm 78 says, yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. Psalm 78:56, yet they tempted and provoked that Most High God and kept not his testimonies. They tempted or tested God repeatedly throughout history. It's repeated 3 times in Psalm 78 alone, asking for meat or food for their lust or desires. God provided Israel's needs in the wilderness, but sometimes the people demanded more. He gave them manna, but they soon wanted meat, the food of their fancy, as stated in Numbers 11:4 through 10. This was a test of God. God promises to provide for our needs, but he never promises to give us the food or the things of our desires or fancy. Adrian Rogers, this is a quote from Adrian Rogers. Now God had blessed the nation of Israel, and God had delivered them from the gnawing and tormenting chains of slavery, and God had brought them into a good land. And God gave them a law, God gave them a land, God gave them a Lord. But what they did was to defile the land, deny the Lord, disobey the law, and judgment came to them. Now Asaph, the psalmist, is giving some instruction to a nation like this, and I'm telling you there is a great parallel and there's an ancient truth for today's world. Now that was Adrian Rogers. Now verse 19 says, yea, they spoke against God. They said, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? So they're eating up their food, and now they're saying, God, we're hungry, and God, can you furnish us a table in the wilderness? Verse 20 says, behold, he smote or struck the rock, that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Now, can he give us bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people? They questioned God's ability. They questioned his generosity. They had little to no faith in God's ability and possibly God's willingness to provide for them. Exodus 16:12, I have heard the murmurings, translated as complaints. So they have heard, God says, I have heard the complaints or murmurings of the children of Israel. Now we all know the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The people complained. Within 2 months of leaving Egypt, they were complaining that they were starving. Exodus 16:4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. Exodus 16:5, and it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Exodus 16:11 through 12, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel, and speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And in verses 27-28, in Psalm 78, it says, he rained flesh upon them as dust, and feathered fowls like the sands of the sea, and he let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their habitations. Dust and sand are innumerable. They are indicators of God's generosity. Genesis 13:16 says, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, and so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall the seed also be numbered. In other words, you can't do it. Psalms 78 verses 29 and 30 says, so they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desires. They were not estranged from their lust. He did not ignore them. Verses 21 and 22 says, therefore the Lord heard this and was wroth. He was angry. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation. Verse 23, though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them corn of heaven. On verse 24, he says, he had rained down manna upon them to eat and given them the corn of heaven. Now, that corn of heaven kind of confused a lot of people. In the Jewish encyclopedia, it says the manna is also designated bread. It is also called the corn of heaven, the bread of the mighty, and the light bread in Numbers 21:5. Manna descended in the night in the form of coriander seed of the color of bdellium, so that in the morning the ground looked as if it was covered with hoarfrost. The grains were ground, pounded into flour, and then the flour was prepared and baked in the form of cakes, the taste of which was like that of the wafers made with honey, or the taste of fresh oil, from Exodus 16:31 and Numbers 11:8. I see pictures of these verses, and here's these loaves of bread falling from heaven. It was seed, and the seed was ground up, and they baked the bread. So that's corn of heaven. Now verse 25 says, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. Most commentaries interpret this to mean food provided by the efforts of the angels, and more than enough to meet the needs of the people. In verse 26, he says, he caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by his power he brought in the south wind. This seems to be a reference to Numbers 11:31. The Lord sent a wind that brought quail from the sea and let them fall into the camp and all around it. As far as one could walk in the day in any direction, there were quail lying 3 and 4 deep above there was quail flying 3 to 4 deep above the ground. In verses 26 and 31 is a description of how God powerfully and generously satisfied the people's desires. But they did not respond with gratitude or faith. The people were disobedient and rebellious and demanding, and God's wrath and judgment came upon the people. Verse 30b, the second part of verse 30 says, while their food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came against them. Verse 33, Numbers 11:33 states it like this, but while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. God gave a disobedient and rebellious Israel all they desired and craved, and the quail turned to a plague of judgment among them. Verse 32 says, for all this they sinned still. They believed not his wondrous works. Therefore their days did he consume in vanity, and their years in trouble. There was a lack of gratitude. There was no alarm at punishment inflicted upon the nation. They just, it happened. The stubborn or stiff-necked people continue to sin. Psalm 78:40 says, how often they provoked him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. Psalm 78:41. Yes, again and again they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. Psalm 78 verses 56 through 58. Yet they tested and provoked the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned back and acted unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. Verse 34 says, when he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God. Verse 35, and they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. Verse 36, nevertheless they did flatter him with their mouths, and they lied unto him with their tongues. Their repentance was forced. Verse 34, when he slew them, they sought him. Not until he put judgment on them did they turn and look to him and offer up some repentance. But it was insincere, short-lived, if not false and faked, as verse 36 implies. They did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues. They faked it. Now verse 37 goes on to say, for their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. Verse 38 says, but he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not, yet many a time turned his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath. Verse 39, for he remembered that they were They were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again. The Living Bible puts this verse like this: for he remembered that they were merely mortal men, gone in a moment like a breath of wind. The phrase that they were flesh, Romans 8 verses 3 through 7 expands on that phrase. It says, for what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. It continues with, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, they set their minds to the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. Now the phrase, gone in a moment like a breath of wind, is explained in James 4:14. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes away. Flesh is weak, frail, and God, who made man, has compassion for our weaknesses. Verse 38 told us, but he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. God understands our weaknesses and is patient with us. The Bible tells us, for we have not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Hebrews 4:15-16. Now, Psalm 78 is a psalm of instruction. It's also a psalm of warnings for Israel not to repeat their sins, for us not to follow Israel's path. It's a psalm to remember God's saving acts and persistent grace, to remember to keep faith with God and his covenant, to have loyalty and trust and obedience to God. 1 Corinthians 10:11-12. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. So that's the end of Psalm 78, and I leave you with this quote from a sermon by Adrian Rogers. You know, we've been reminded that today America is number one, but unfortunately we're number one in homosexuality, radical feminism, divorce, abortion, political correctness, and the destruction of family values. You say yes, but we're also economically number one. I, for one, had rather leave our children a legacy of great and godly principles than to leave to them a nation of great wealth to be squandered in a godless society. Adrian Rogers continued in this quote, I want to tell you this, friend, I am only one man, but I want to do the best I can where I am, with what I have, with every chance that I get. If we do that, we can change this city. I tell you, we can change this nation. There are enough Christians in America, if they will wake up and do right, if they will review their history, if they will renew their memory, they can reclaim their legacy. So that ends it, and I will leave you with this. As Pastor Birch would say, it's something to ponder. As Pastor Crank has told us, I challenge you to review, to renew, to learn from, and pass on this history and these values. Have a great week.